Hey everyone, thanks for being here. We're getting so much closer to actually writing your manuscript. So in this class so far, we've gone from how do you create an idea, taking that spark of inspiration, to developing our characters we're going to be using in this novel. And now we're finally ready for the next step, step 3, which is to start outlining. Now, a few differentiations we need to make. There are two types of writers basically out there in the world. So the first one is called a pantser. And that is the type of writer who flies by the seat of their pants and they just hit the ground running and they just go. The second type of writer is the outliner who meticulously works on the outline, has all of their ideas down and in order, the chapters mapped out so that when they sit down, they're almost just filling in the blanks or the blank space to weave the story together. Both types of writers exist. Both types of writers are famous. There is not a right answer to this. Some of us fall somewhere in the middle of the extremes, and that's kind of where I am. So I'm going to walk you through my process today, but realize that there are two other extremes out there, that you could just be a pantser who doesn't do any outlining, or you could be an extreme outliner. There are some writers who spend months or even years outlining before they write the book. I'm going to give you my suggestion for your first novel, and it's what has really worked for me over the years. It helps me stay organized and write a story that is compelling without spending a ton of time on the outlining. I find for me, if I spend too much time on the outlining, I get bored with my story, and then I don't have the motivation to write. Stephen King talks a lot about how you need to write as quickly as possible when you're writing a first draft, or you kind of lose the nerve, and I totally agree with that. So we're going to talk about steps today for outlining your story. As a new writer, I think the most scary thing about writing a book is how do you write something that long? I remember I had this idea. I had been used to writing short stories and poems up until this point. I had never tackled a full book. That's part of the reason I wrote my first book, was just to see if I could do it. So for many people, there's that whole thing that is very daunting. I challenge you not to think about that. Do not look at this as you're writing 200 or 300 pages. Look at it in tiny chunks. I look at my books almost chapter by chapter, and I treat each chapter almost like a short story in my mind. I make sure they weave together. I make sure I know where the story's going, but I kind of chunk it down. So I don't tell myself you're writing 300 pages. I tell myself, okay, today you're writing a chapter, which is basically like writing a story. I find that that makes it so much more manageable. So what I recommend for you to do, how I handle this. So I've got my idea. I've got my characters who I know inside and out at this point. I know their names. I know every detail about them. Usually by this point, after I've spent so much time thinking about this story, I also know the opening scene of the book. Now, when you're first starting, this opening scene you start with might change. You might write the whole book and realize you started it in the wrong place. Don't get too hung up on that. In fact, in our project, one of your options is to work on your first opening scene for your book. Because really, it just gets the ball rolling. It gets the momentum going. It gets you inspired. If you can write the first 2 pages and get excited about them, you'll find that writing the rest of the book, it's just kind of like a snowball rolling. Once you get it going, you won't really be able to stop. You'll have to keep telling the story. So we start with the opening scene. I write the first 2 to 3 pages. Sometimes for a writer, that's a prologue. Sometimes you're writing chapter 1. But I really just think in my head, what is the most compelling scene I can put my character in this book? Where am I going to start it? And how, in the first scene, can I kind of show what's at stake for the character? Most writers tend to put too much exposition in the front end of their story. You want to take all those character details you told us and you just want to put them on the page and get it out there because you're afraid you're going to forget to put something in. Don't do that. That's the number one mistake I see in my writing classes. That's the number one mistake I think new authors make, is feeling like you have to tell everything up front. Let us have a sense of mystery. Let us have some questions going into it, but make sure we know that there's something at stake for your character. Maybe in the first scene you show us that someone's going to die. Maybe you show us in the first scene very vaguely that someone has suffered a horrible loss and they're really struggling. Show us something that's at stake so we're pulled in emotionally. Give us a hook to keep reading. Once I have that first scene figured out, then I start working through my outline. The way I do it is I have a very vague idea of the plot arc. So what I mean by that is I know kind of what the main problem is that I'm introducing. I know the climax of the book, and I know some of the following action. I probably don't have my ending figured out quite yet. Usually that comes later. For some people, you might know your ending and you can put that in. What I do then is I treat each chapter as kind of its own story. So I will then loosely outline chapter and what event I want to happen in that chapter. So chapter 1 is going to be where I introduce the character and what's at stake. Chapter 2, what is going to be the main hallmarking event of that chapter, or what is the main idea I need to get across to keep the story going. I find that if I outline like that very vaguely, just with one focal point for each chapter, it gives me the freedom to explore and express in my writing, which I enjoy, but it also keeps me focused. It kind of helps me pace my story out. If you have an idea of what each chapter will be about, then you have an idea of your pace and you're making sure that the story keeps moving. It kind of helps you from having chapters that are like dead chapters that serve no purpose. It keeps the story trucking along, keeps it moving in a fashion that people will enjoy. And I find too, when I sit down to write, it's easier when I have kind of a cheat sheet for myself. When I sit down and I'm like, I don't know where the story's going, but I can look and I have an event idea. Again, I treat it like a short story and almost write the short story featuring my character with that event in mind. So I want you today to sit down and start outlining some of your events. You do not have to fill them all in. You don't have to have every detail filled in, but fill in the main ones. Give yourself kind of a roadmap to follow as we go into the next step where we actually talk about point of view and how to choose which one to tell your novel in.